All right, let's go. Number 10. The Cave of Letters. In March of 1961, Yigael Yadin's team roped down a 150-meter cliff face above Nahal Hever in the Judean desert into a cave the Bedouin had known about for years, and the Israel Antiquities Authority had not. Dust hung thick enough to taste. Wedged beneath a rock ledge, a team member's fingers found a bundle wrapped in leather. Brittle at the edges, and inside it, papyrus. What came out of that cave over 2 seasons was the largest cache of personal correspondence from Roman-era Judea ever recovered. 15 letters and orders written by Simon bar Kokheba, the commander of the Second Jewish Revolt against Rome, alongside the 35-document legal archive of a woman named Babatha, property deeds, marriage contracts. Court filings, the paperwork of an ordinary life preserved by an extraordinary death. Yadin, working under Hebrew University and the Israel Exploration Society, published the letters in installments over the following decade. Bar Kokheba signed them as Nesi Yisrael, President of Israel, and the tone is not inspirational. It is administrative, curt, and occasionally furious, threatening named commanders with consequences for failing to supply troops. Babatha's archive alone runs to 35 documents in 3 languages, Greek, Aramaic, and Nabatean, covering a date palm grove she owned near Ein Gedi, 2 marriages, a custody dispute over her son, and a lawsuit against her stepdaughters over an inheritance. It is, by a wide margin, the single largest cache of ordinary legal paperwork surviving from Roman Judea, and it exists only because Babatha rolled the entire bundle, tied it with cord, and hid it in a leather water skin inside a crevice in this cave before the Roman siege closed in. Coins recovered from the same period elsewhere in the Judean desert, struck during the revolt, carry the Hebrew inscription Year 1 of the Redemption of Israel, propaganda currency, for a war that, within 4 years, would end in the near total collapse of Jewish settlement in Judea. The revolt's leader is remembered by a different name in Jewish tradition, Bar Kokhba, son of a star. The label comes from Numbers 24:17, a star shall come forth out of Jacob. A line the Jerusalem Talmud records Rabbi Akiva applying directly to this man, hailing him as the promised deliverer. His actual name, preserved in his own handwriting across a dozen documents, was Bar Kokheba, son of Kokheba, a place name with no messianic weight at all. The single vowel shift between Kokheba and Kokhba is the entire distance between an ordinary military commander and a national redeemer. Consider the implication. The letters found in that cave are not the words of a star. They are the words of a man rationing grain and threatening deserters, written by the same hand later mythologized as messianic on the strength of a single verse. The gap between the paperwork and the legend was manufactured within a single generation by the most respected rabbi of his era, and it has never fully closed. The Roman siege camp above the cave is still visible today, its low stone walls outlining where a garrison of 80 to 100 soldiers waited for the people below to starve or surrender. They did not surrender. The skeletal remains found scattered through the cave's chambers were eventually reburied beneath a monument on the cliff above, a monument whose plaque has been vandalized and repaired more than once, the only marker for people whose names, unlike their commanders, were never recorded at all. Most of what's covered in this video didn't fit, and if this kind of digging is useful to you. The fuller research behind this series, including the sites that didn't make the final 10, is laid out in the free ebook linked in the description below. Number 9. The Sealed Reliquary of Sveti Ivan. On the 1st of August 2010, archaeologist Kazimir Popkonstantinov lifted a small marble sarcophagus from beneath the altar of a 5th century basilica on a Black Sea island off Sozopol, Bulgaria. Inside it sat a tufa ossuary, sealed, inscribed in Greek. He turned it over. The inscription named a saint and a date, June the 24th. The reliquary held 6 human bone fragments, a knuckle bone, part of a jaw, a rib, a tooth, fragments of a skull, plus animal bones packed in beside them. June 24th is the traditional feast day marking the birth of John the Baptist. The date recorded in Luke's account of his mother Elizabeth giving birth after Zechariah's period of silence lifted. National Geographic funded independent testing at the Oxford Radiocarbon Accelerator Unit, where Professor Tom Hyam ran the analysis. The result, published in 2020 in the Journal of Archaeological Science with Pop Konstantinov as co-author, dated one bone to between 5 and 75 AD. Squarely within John the Baptist's lifetime, DNA sequencing confirmed the remains belonged to a single Middle Eastern male. Hyam was careful about what the result did and did not prove. There is no genetic reference sample for a 1st century Judean holy man, no database against which to confirm identity. What the testing does confirm is narrower and in its way. More interesting, the bones are not a medieval or modern fabrication, not a set of mismatched remains gathered from a common grave centuries after the fact, and not the product of the relic trade that flooded medieval Europe with fabricated saints' bones by the thousands. They are exactly what they would need to be. If the inscription is telling the truth, a single individual, correctly aged. Correctly located in time, wrapped and sealed with a level of care that suggests whoever hid them believed exactly what the box claimed. The obvious rebuttal is that Sveti Ivan is an obscure island shrine with every incentive to manufacture a miracle. That rebuttal loses force against the sequence of events. Pope Konstantinov did not announce a discovery of John the Baptist's relics. He announced a reliquary with an inscription, then invited outside, secular, foreign laboratories with no stake in Bulgarian church tourism to test it, and waited 2 years for Oxford's answer, rather than asserting the identification himself. The excavation itself was a modest, government-funded dig on a small island monastery, not a well-funded operation with a predetermined outcome to protect. But here's where the comparison becomes difficult to ignore. Topkapi Palace in Istanbul claims to hold John the Baptist's skull and forearm. The Cathedral of Amiens in France claims to hold his skull as well. Neither institution has ever submitted its relics for radiocarbon dating or genetic analysis. The only fragments of John the Baptist ever tested for authenticity are the ones from an island shrine most of Christendom has never heard of, while the famous relics, venerated for centuries in 2 of Europe's most visited cathedrals, have never been tested at all. Pope Konstantinov, describing the discovery afterward, put it almost apologetically, it was, he said. Logical to suggest that the monastery's founders would have wanted relics of their own patron saint close at hand, and logical is as far as he was willing to go without laboratory confirmation. That restraint matters, because the competing claims elsewhere in the Mediterranean have never shown the same caution. The Topkapi Palace Museum's claim to John the Baptist's forearm traces back through Ottoman Constantinople, itself inheriting relics from the Byzantine imperial collection. Amiens Cathedral's claimed skull arrived from the Fourth Crusade's sack of Constantinople in 1204. One of thousands of relics that flooded into Western Europe during and after that campaign. Verified by nothing more than the word of the knight who carried it home. Both stories are centuries old, both are unverifiable by any means available at the time they were told, and both have remained that way by choice rather than by accident. The Sozopol bones now sit behind glass in a parish church, displayed on set feast days under guard. The sealed box that hid them for roughly 15 centuries has been replaced by a newer kind of seal, institutional silence, on the part of the shrines with more to lose from an answer. Number 8. The tomb that resealed itself. On the morning of June 27, 2019, the French consulate in Jerusalem reopened the gate to the tombs of the kings for the first time in 9 years. 15 visitors, pre-registered online, filed through. Then a group of ultra-Orthodox men who had not registered pushed toward the gate to pray inside. Israeli police intervened. By afternoon, the French consulate announced the site would close again, this time indefinitely. The tomb had been sealed once already, for very different reasons, roughly 2,000 years earlier. French archaeologist Félicien de Saulcy excavated the site in 1863, recovering sarcophagi now housed in the Louvre, one bearing an Aramaic inscription reading Our Mistress, the Queen, widely attributed to Helena of Adiabene, a Mesopotamian monarch who converted to Judaism and relocated to Jerusalem with her sons in the 1st century. The Greek travel writer Pausanias, describing the tomb in the 2nd century, marveled at its engineering, a stone door, he wrote, that would not open until the calendar returned to the exact day and hour of its sealing, then closed itself again unaided. The tomb's grandeur made an impression on ancient visitors long before modern archaeologists arrived. Pausanias ranked it the 2nd most beautiful tomb he had ever seen, behind only the mausoleum at Halicarnassus, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. The complex spans roughly 250 square meters below ground, cut from solid rock, with stone shelves that once held sarcophagi arranged around a central courtyard reached by a monumental staircase. When the 20th century French scholar and Dominican friar Jean-Baptiste Humbert re-examined the architecture, he argued the scale and style fit a member of the Herodian dynasty more precisely than Helena's family, proposing instead Herod Agrippa I, grandson of Herod the Great, as the tomb's intended occupant. The identification remains disputed even among the scholars, who agree the tomb belonged to someone of real consequence. The renovation that closed the site in 2010 cost roughly 1.1 million euros and took 9 years. Acts 11:28. 30 records a prophet named Agabus predicting a severe famine across the Roman world under Claudius, and Josephus separately records that Helena of Adiabene, moved by the same crisis, shipped grain from Egypt and figs from Cyprus to feed Jerusalem's starving population. The tomb of the woman whose famine relief is independently confirmed by a Jewish historian sits behind a locked gate she may never have anticipated, controlled by a foreign consulate, contested by the descendants of the people she fed. Ownership of the tomb has its own tangled history. In 1847, the Ottoman governor of Jerusalem ordered a search of the tomb for buried treasure. None was found. In 1878, the Pereire brothers, French Jewish bankers, purchased the site and eventually transferred it to the French state, on what a Jewish organization has since argued in French court was an understanding that Jewish visitors would retain the right to visit and pray there in perpetuity. That 2019 lawsuit, brought by the group Hekdesh through attorney G. William Goldnadel, is still part of why the site's access remains a live legal question rather than a settled arrangement. One more layer of dispute stacked on top of a tomb whose actual occupant nobody has definitively proven. The excavations began under de Saulcy in 1863, on the assumption he was uncovering the tombs of the biblical kings of Judah themselves. That specific claim was abandoned within a generation of the dig, but the name outlived the theory, and tourists still arrive today asking to see the grave of David or Solomon in a tomb almost certainly built for someone else entirely. France tried once more, on October 24th of that same year, opening the gate a second time under tighter restrictions, 30 visitors at a time, online registration mandatory, a modest entry fee. That reopening held. But the underlying tension never resolved. Jerusalem's own regional archaeologist for the Israel Antiquities Authority, Yuval Baruch, has said publicly that he considers it probably the most important, fascinating, and large monument in Jerusalem outside the Old City, and has argued the artifacts removed to the Louvre a century and a half ago belong back at the site itself, a request France has never granted. Consider the implication. A door engineered in antiquity to seal itself on a schedule now cannot stay open through a single afternoon of modern visitors without a diplomatic incident. By nightfall on June 27th, the gate was locked again. The sarcophagus attributed to the Queen remains in Paris. The tomb she may have built for her family is, once more, empty of everyone but the dead. Number 7. Suleiman's Seal. In the winter of 1854, American missionary James Turner Barclay was walking outside Jerusalem's Damascus Gate with his son and his dog when the dog vanished into the ground. Barclay's son found a drainage cistern at the base of the rock, from somewhere deep inside it, barking. That night, Barclay and his sons returned in Arab dress, carrying candles, and slipped through the opening into a cavern that had not seen daylight in over 300 years. What they found was a 5-acre limestone quarry running the length of 5 city blocks beneath the Muslim Quarter, one of the largest man-made caverns in Israel, carved out over centuries to supply the pale, easily worked Maleki stone used across ancient Jerusalem, including by tradition. The Temple Mount itself. Ottoman Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, rebuilding the city's walls in the 1530s, had ordered the quarry blocked and sealed around 1540, worried that an unguarded tunnel running under the walls was a security risk waiting to be exploited. It worked. The cave disappeared from official memory for over 3 centuries, resurfacing only through a dog's nose and a missionary's curiosity. The rediscovery did not stay quiet for long. Ottoman authorities, hearing that a foreigner had found a way underneath their fortifications, quickly moved to restrict access again, worried for exactly the same security reason Suleiman had cited 3 centuries earlier. In the 1880s, a German religious sect took up residence inside the cavern itself, living in its damp, unlit chambers, until so many of them fell ill that the German consul in Jerusalem had them physically evacuated. In 1873, French archaeologist Charles Clermont Ganneau documented a carved winged figure in a niche deep inside. A detail some have linked to the cherubim described flanking the ark in Solomon's temple, though the carving's date remains unconfirmed. The quarry stone continued to be cut in small amounts as late as the early 1900s for a Turkish clock tower over the Jaffa Gate, the last recorded use of a quarry that, by tradition, opened its very first chapter under Solomon nearly 3,000 years earlier. In 1968, an East Jerusalem resident approached Israel's Ministry of Finance, claiming his grandfather had buried 3 cases of gold somewhere inside the cave during the Ottoman period, and offered to reveal the location for a quarter share. The ministry agreed and dug a deep hole at the spot he indicated. No gold was ever found. The story is a near-exact echo of the 1847 treasure search at the tombs of the kings across the city, 2 different sealed spaces in Jerusalem, a century apart, both rated on rumor, both empty. The cave's association with Solomon has made it, since the 1860s, one of the more unusual pilgrimage sites in the city for an entirely different reason: Freemasons, whose ritual identifies Solomon as their symbolic first Grand Master, have held ceremonial gatherings inside the quarry since 1868, treating the space quarried in the king's name as a kind of spiritual headquarters, regardless of whether Solomon's own workers ever set foot in it. British archaeologist and Freemason Sir Charles Warren, who surveyed Jerusalem for the Palestine Exploration Fund in the 1860s, personally championed the Masonic use of the cavern, cementing a tradition that has now outlasted the British mandate that once controlled the city. The cavern carries a name it may not fully deserve: Zedekiah's Cave, after the last king of Judah. Tradition, recorded by the medieval commentator Rashi, not by the biblical text itself, holds that Zedekiah fled through this tunnel network during the Babylonian siege. But 2 Kings 25:4 and Jeremiah 39:4 describe something narrower and starker: the king and his soldiers breaking through the city wall at night near the royal garden, fleeing toward the plain of Jericho, where Babylonian forces overtook them. Neither passage mentions a cave. What makes this particularly unsettling is not the legend. It's the detail the legend obscures. 1 Kings 5 describes Solomon's quarrymen cutting great stones, costly stones for the temple's foundation, and the proximity of this exact quarry to the Temple Mount has led generations of archaeologists to conclude that this is very plausibly where those stones came from. A genuine architectural link to the First Temple, sitting underneath a name borrowed from a king who almost certainly never set foot inside it. Deep in the cave's innermost chamber, water still drips steadily from the ceiling, a formation locals have called Zedekiah's Tears for over a century, one droplet at a time, in a chamber that took 300 years to be noticed missing, and is now sat open, studied, and argued over for 170 more. The tears belong to the wrong king. The stone, very possibly, belongs to the right temple. Number 6. The Recantation. In 1974, Italian archaeologist Paolo Mathia's excavation team at Tel Marduk in northern Syria uncovered the first cache of what would eventually number more than 17,000 cuneiform tablets, the administrative archive of the Bronze Age kingdom of Ebla. The mission's epigrapher Giovanni Pettinato was summoned from Rome. On October 29, 1976, at a Society of Biblical Literature meeting in St. Louis, Pettinato announced that one tablet listed the 5 cities of the plain from Genesis 14: Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, Zeboim, and Bela, in the same order the biblical text gives them. Over dinner with Professor David Noel Friedman of the University of Michigan, Pettinato went further, writing down the name of a king of Gomorrah he claimed to have read in the archive, Birsha. The claim traveled through the press for months before anyone could check it, because the tablets themselves had not yet been published for outside review. When scholars finally got access, the reading collapsed. Pettinato could no longer locate the name Birsha on rechecking. 3 of the 5 city names he'd announced, Admah, Zeboim, and Bela, were quietly withdrawn from the discussion entirely. Alfonso Archi, the epigrapher who eventually replaced Pettinato on the mission, spent the following years methodically rereading the tablets Pettinato had cited and fiercely contested nearly every biblical connection Pettinato had proposed, from the patriarchal names to a supposed reference to Yahweh worship. The dispute wasn't confined to a seminar room or a single conference hall. It fractured the excavation itself. Pettinato accused Mathieu of hoarding the tablets and blocking rapid publication for territorial reasons. Mathieu and the Syrian government, in turn, accused Pettinato of courting sensational headlines the evidence couldn't support. At a moment when the political implications of biblical proof in a Syrian excavation were combustible in their own right. But here's where the retraction becomes the real story. Syria's government reacted to the initial biblical claims not with scholarly rebuttal, but with a political declaration. The director of the Syrian Department of Antiquities, Afif Banasi, characterized the biblical readings as a politically motivated attempt to bolster claims connected to the modern state of Israel, and secured an official statement in which Pettinato, in effect, recanted his own findings. Paolo Mathieu, the excavation's director, went further still, writing in 1979 that the Ebla archive offers no documentary support for the patriarchal narratives, no evidence of Yahweh worship, no mention of Sodom and Gomorrah, and no flood story. By 1979, Pettinato had resigned from the mission entirely. By 1979, the strain had become public and permanent. Pettinato resigned from the Italian mission to Ebla entirely, describing the project's management afterward as stifling to scholarly progress. Mathieu replaced him with Alfonso Archi, who adopted deliberately cautious, narrow readings focused on lexical and economic data rather than anything resembling literary or historical extrapolation. A methodological retreat that was also, unmistakably, a political one. Ceramic evidence from the site independently anchors the archive to the mid-3rd millennium BC, roughly the mid-2300s, based on parallels with pottery sequences from northern Syria, centuries earlier than even the earliest proposed dates for Abraham, which makes any direct textual connection to Genesis chronologically difficult regardless of the naming disputes. What survived the collapse of the sensational claims is less exciting and more solid, but arguably more important, an archive of genuine Bronze Age significance, predating the traditional dating of Abraham by centuries, containing personal names built on the Semitic root for God that echo distantly through later Hebrew naming conventions. That archive now sits split across 3 museums inside a country that has spent the last decade at war. Access for outside researchers, difficult even before 2011, has become close to impossible since. The region around Tel Marduk in Idlib province passed through multiple armed factions during the Syrian conflict, and the broader museum network holding comparable Syrian antiquities suffered documented looting and damage throughout the war years. Scholars who once traveled freely to consult the tablets now depend on decades-old photographs and the handful of translated volumes Pettinato and Archi managed to publish before the door closed. What began as a scholarly disagreement over a handful of city names ended as something closer to a hostage situation, with an entire Bronze Age archive effectively removed from active research by forces that have nothing to do with archaeology at all. A government forced a scholar to take back his own words in public in a matter of months. No comparable authority has ever forced anyone to take back the silence that followed, because there has been no functioning authority left to ask. If digging through evidence like this is genuinely useful to you, rather than just being told what to believe, sticking around and subscribing is what keeps this channel able to do it. Number 5. The High Priest's Box. On a cold day in November 1990, construction crews building a recreation park in Jerusalem's Peace Forest broke through the roof of an underground cave. Israel Antiquities Authority archaeologist Zvi Greenhut arrived to check what he expected to be a routine report. The area, just south of the Old City, had served as a Second Temple-era burial ground for centuries. Looking down through the collapsed ceiling, he could already count 4 limestone ossuaries scattered in the chamber below. 12 ossuaries in total came out of that cave, 6 of them found in situ, untouched for nearly 2,000 years, and 6 more overturned and broken, evidence of tomb robbers who had ransacked the site in antiquity and missed exactly the 2 boxes that mattered most. 2 carried the same Aramaic inscription, in slightly different spelling: Yehoseph bar Caiapha, Joseph, son of Caiaphas. 1 was elaborately decorated with rosettes and geometric carving, and held the bones of a man who had died around the age of 60. Josephus names a high priest, Joseph Caiaphas, who served from roughly 18 to 36 CE. The exact tenure the canonical Gospels assign to the high priest presiding over the arrest and trial of Jesus. Matthew 26:57 places him at the center of that trial. John 18:13, 14, and 24 name him directly. Greenhut himself later described the moment of recognition with the flat precision of someone who has learned not to overstate a find: the cave's floor plan. The rectangular standing pit cut inside the entrance so ancient mourners could stand upright in the low chamber, the 4 loculi carved into the rock, all of it, before a single inscription was even read, told him exactly what period and what community had built this tomb. Only later, cleaning the limestone by hand, did the specific name surface. The find sits in useful contrast to a very different Caiaphas adjacent artifact that surfaced on the antiquities market over a decade later, the so-called James Ossuary, whose disputed inscription and forgery trial became its own controversy entirely. The Peace Forest Ossuary shares none of that uncertainty. It was excavated in a controlled salvage operation by government archaeologists. Its find spot fully documented, its context never in question, its chain of custody unbroken from the moment the roof collapsed to the museum case it sits in today. Whatever doubts exist about relics that surface through private dealers, this is not one of them. And scholars from James Charlesworth to James Vanderkam have treated the identification as one of the more secure epigraphic links between the archaeological record and a named figure from the Passion narratives. That security is exactly what makes the aftermath so unsettling. The construction crew that first broke through the cave's roof had no idea what they were standing on top of, and were, by every account, close to simply clearing the site and continuing their landscaping work before the Antiquities Authority intervened. A recreation park nearly buried, without record, the tomb of the man who interrogated Jesus of Nazareth. What makes this particularly unsettling is not the inscription. It's what happened after. Under Jewish law, the human remains inside the ossuary could not simply sit in a museum storeroom. They were reburied on the Mount of Olives within a short time of their discovery. The empty ossuary went to what is now the Israel Museum, where it can still be viewed today. But the burial cave itself, the original context, the niches, the 6 other ossuaries robbed by tomb raiders centuries before Greenhut ever arrived, was backfilled under the park construction it had briefly interrupted. Scholars have the box. They no longer have the room it came out of. There is a further irony worth sitting with. Second Temple period Jewish burial custom held that gathering a family's bones into an ossuary a year after death reflected belief in eventual bodily resurrection, the same hope, differently framed, that the man buried in this particular box spent his career as high priest trying to manage, contain, and ultimately hand over to Rome for execution. Caiaphas presided over the end of a life whose followers would go on to insist, within years, that death itself had been reversed. His own bones went through the ordinary Jewish ritual of secondary burial, waited 2,000 years in an unmarked niche, and were finally disturbed not by scholars or pilgrims, but by a bulldozer clearing ground for a children's playground. The ossuary sits under museum lighting now, its carved rosettes photographed from every angle, its inscription translated in a dozen languages on the placard beside it. The cave that held it for 2 millennia is a manicured lawn in a public park, and no one walking across it today has any way of knowing what used to be 6 feet beneath their shoes. Number 4. 600 years untouched. In January of 2026, restoration engineers stood at the entrance to the Grotto of the Nativity in Bethlehem, preparing to do something no one had been legally authorized to do to that specific space in 600 years. Touch it. The grotto, a cave beneath the Church of the Nativity, marked by a 14-point silver star, is venerated as the site described in Luke 2:7. Mary wrapping her newborn son and laying him in a manger because there was no room at the inn. Constantine's mother, Helena, identified the site around 325 AD. The basilica above it has stood, in one form or another, since Emperor Justinian rebuilt it in the 6th century, making it the oldest continuously used church building in the world. But the grotto itself has existed for centuries inside a legal cage. In 1852, under pressure from competing European powers, the Ottoman government issued a firman fixing the status quo of the holy sites, a decree so rigid that even the placement of a lamp or the sweeping of a particular step is fixed by precedent and cannot be altered without triggering a formal dispute among the Greek Orthodox, Armenian Apostolic, and Roman Catholic authorities who jointly control the building. Codified further by the Treaty of Berlin in 1878 and recognized by the United Nations in 1949, the status quo has functioned for over a century and a half as a kind of archaeological gag order. No excavation, no restoration, no scientific examination of the grotto itself has been legally possible without unanimous consent that has almost never been reached. The 1834 and 1837 Jerusalem area earthquakes damaged the building's furnishings and bell tower. Repairs to the periphery happened in fits and starts, but the grotto's own fabric went untouched. It took a 2024 presidential decree from Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas, backed for the first time by consensus among all 3 custodian churches, to authorize restoration work inside the grotto itself, beginning in early 2026. 600 years is the span the churches themselves have cited for how long that specific space has gone without structural intervention of any kind. The status quo's rigidity is not exaggerated for effect. Under its terms, the exact placement of a lamp, the specific staircase a given clergyman is permitted to use, and the precise timing of a procession are all frozen by 19th century precedent, and violating that precedent, even by a few inches or a few minutes, has repeatedly triggered physical altercations between monks in the very building meant to commemorate the Prince of Peace. A brawl broke out between Armenian and Greek Orthodox clergy inside the complex as recently as 2011, over nothing more than a broom left in the wrong place during cleaning duties. Multiply that friction by a proposal to excavate, drill, or scientifically sample the actual birth grotto, and the reason no one has managed it in 6 centuries becomes considerably easier to understand. The status quo governing Bethlehem is not an isolated document. It draws on the same 19th century framework that governs the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, where an identical patchwork of frozen precedent has produced its own well-documented absurdities, including a wooden ladder left leaning against an external window ledge since at least 1850s photographs, because no single custodian community has ever agreed on who has the authority to move it. The Nativity Grotto's 6th century silence is not an eccentric exception. It is the predictable, load-bearing outcome of a system explicitly designed to make change require unanimous consent among parties who have spent centuries actively refusing to give it. UNESCO listed the Church of the Nativity as a World Heritage Site in 2012, the first site inscribed under the name Palestine. And even that inscription came with an unusual designation. The site was listed simultaneously as endangered, largely because of the very stalemate that had kept anyone from repairing it properly for so long. Consider the implication. A legal instrument drafted in the 19th century to end a property squabble between competing monks has functioned ever since as the single most effective preservation order and the single most effective barrier to archaeological knowledge at the traditional birthplace of Jesus. Nobody voted to freeze the site in time. A treaty about who gets to sweep the floor did that, by accident, for 174 years. Even the limited archaeological work that has happened around the grotto's edges illustrates how narrow the permitted space has been. Italian Franciscan archaeologist Bellarmino Bugatti, working through the mid-20th century, was permitted to study the areas surrounding the monastery and the Constantinian-era octagonal foundation uncovered during British excavations in the 1930s. But his findings, however scientifically significant, were confined to the periphery. The grotto's own floor, walls, and substrate, the physical cave itself as opposed to the buildings constructed around it, remained legally untouchable throughout his entire career and for decades after his death. Bugatti's work nonetheless mattered enough that the international scientific community eventually came to treat the surrounding Franciscan excavations as more than pious tradition, proof that careful archaeology could be done at the edges of a site even while the heart of it stayed legally frozen. The silver star still marks the spot. The firman that protects it is still, technically, in force. And as of this year, for the first time in 6 centuries, someone is finally allowed to look underneath. Number 3. The railing that gave way. On May 8, 2007, Hebrew University archaeologist Ehud Netzer stood at a flattened terrace halfway up the hill at Herodium, 12 kilometers south of Jerusalem, and confirmed what 35 years of excavation had been aimed at finding: fragments of an ornately carved limestone sarcophagus, smashed deliberately in antiquity, bearing no human imagery in keeping with Jewish custom. It was, his team concluded, the tomb of Herod the Great, a discovery the ancient world's most obsessive builder had gone to considerable lengths, according to the historian Josephus, to make impossible to find. Netzer had begun searching for the tomb in 1972, transitioning into archaeology after training as an architect and working under Yigal Yadin at Hazor. Josephus records that Herod was buried at Herodium following an elaborate funeral procession from Jericho, but the historian gives no precise location within the sprawling palace fortress complex, and 35 years of digging turned up nothing conclusive, no inscription, no undisturbed chamber, nothing but the working assumption that Herod, obsessive about his own legacy in every other respect, would not have left his own burial to chance. When Netzer's team finally located fragments of a reddish limestone sarcophagus, smashed into pieces too deliberately to be accidental, the destruction itself became evidence. Someone, likely Jewish rebels during the Great Revolt against Rome roughly 70 years after Herod's death, had gone out of their way to desecrate the tomb of a king many of his own subjects had despised. His team, Ra Porat, Yakov Kalman, and Rachel Chachi-Larace, continued excavating the site for years after the 2007 announcement, uncovering a 450 to 650 seat theater box nearby in 2009 and 2010, decorated with frescoes unlike anything previously found in the region, complete with a private royal viewing box built for an audience of 1. What Netzer would not live to see was how the story of his discovery ended. On October 25, 2010, at 76 years old, Netzer leaned against a wooden railing near the same slope where he'd found Herod's tomb 3 years earlier. The railing gave way. He fell roughly 6 meters, rolled, and kept falling, fracturing his skull and neck vertebrae. He was airlifted to Hadassah Medical Center, where he lived for 2 more days, long enough, deliberately, for a kidney to be donated to someone who needed one, and for his retinas to go to a retina bank. He died on October 28, 2010. Herodium itself was already one of the most personally significant sites in the ancient world to excavate, precisely because Herod built it as a monument to his own survival. According to Josephus, the king ordered the site constructed at the exact spot where he had narrowly escaped a Parthian-backed assassination attempt decades earlier. Then had an artificial cone-shaped mountain raised around a hilltop palace so the fortress would be visible for miles in every direction, a permanent physical assertion of a life he had nearly lost. Netzer had excavated the palace fortress on that engineered mountain for decades before ever finding the tomb complex on the lower slope, in an area he and his team had initially overlooked because it seemed too modest for a king obsessed with monumental scale. The revelation, when it came, reversed decades of assumptions about where a man that obsessed with grandeur would choose to be buried, not at the summit where he had lived, but partway down, in a location deliberately positioned to be visible from the road below, so that anyone approaching Jerusalem from Herodium would see it. In 2013, archaeologists Joseph Patrich and Benjamin Arubis publicly challenged Netzer's identification of the tomb, arguing the structure doesn't match Herodian mausoleum architecture as closely as claimed, and proposing instead that the true tomb remains undiscovered elsewhere on the mountain. The debate remains unresolved among specialists, and it is worth stating plainly, the identification is not settled fact. But here's where the sequence becomes difficult to file away as coincidence alone. A man spends 38 years of his professional life pursuing the burial place of the most notorious builder king of the ancient Near East. He finds it. 3 years later, at that same site, a support structure fails beneath him and kills him. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu issued a public statement the day Netzer died, calling the loss significant for research into Israel's heritage, a rare instance of a national government marking the death of an archaeologist as a matter of state concern. Itself a measure of how central Herodium had become to the country's understanding of its own history. Netzer had trained under Yadin, restored Masada, reconstructed Herod's Jericho palace, and spent nearly 4 decades circling back, again and again, to the one site that refused to give up its answer easily. When it finally did, in 2007. Colleagues described him returning to the dig every season afterward with the same intensity as a man half his age, refusing retirement, refusing to treat the discovery as a finish line rather than a beginning. He was, by every account from the people who worked beside him, still climbing the same slopes at 76 that he had first climbed at 38. Unwilling to hand off a site he had given nearly his entire working life to understand. Access to the tomb area was blocked to the public immediately afterward, pending a safety review of the slope. Netzer never saw that review completed. The base of the tomb, uncovered and photographed and argued over ever since, remains visible from a safe distance. Visible, but not approachable. On the hillside where the man who spent more of his life on it than almost anyone alive last stood. Number 2. The letter that disappeared. In the summer of 1958, Columbia University historian Morton Smith spent 3 weeks at the Greek Orthodox monastery of Mar Saba, in the Judean desert between Jerusalem and the Dead Sea, cataloging manuscripts with permission from the Patriarch of Jerusalem himself. What Smith would spend the rest of his career defending began, he said, with something almost accidental, leafing through the blank-end pages of a 17th century printed book of the letters of Ignatius of Antioch, and finding a handwritten Greek note opening with a small cross that no one had cataloged before. The note claimed to be a letter from Clement of Alexandria, the 2nd century Christian theologian, to a correspondent named Theodore, warning him against a heretical sect called the Carpocratians, and quoting, in the process, 2 passages from a longer, unpublished version of the Gospel of Mark, the Secret Gospel. One passage describes a young man coming to Jesus by night, wearing only a linen cloth over his naked body, and staying with him through the night while Jesus taught him the mystery of the kingdom of God. Smith did not remove the manuscript from the monastery. He photographed it on the spot, left the physical book on its shelf in the Tower Library, and spent the next 15 years building a scholarly case before publishing a full edition in 1973. A delay long enough, critics later argued, for a fabricator to construct an airtight defense in advance. What made the letter combustible on publication wasn't merely its content. It was what that content implied about the canonical Gospel of Mark itself, that the version read by billions of Christians for 2,000 years was, according to Clement's letter, an edited, shortened version of a longer original, and that the editing had been done specifically to remove material the church found compromising. Clement's letter, as Smith transcribed it, instructs Theodore that even under interrogation, he should deny that the longer gospel exists at all. A second-century instruction, if genuine. To actively lie about the existence of an alternate version of a text now considered scripture. What Smith's secret mark echoes is a genuinely strange detail already sitting in the canonical text, unexplained. Mark 14:51-52 describes an unnamed young man following Jesus at his arrest wearing nothing but a linen cloth, who flees naked when soldiers grab him, a detail unique to Mark's gospel. Absent from Matthew, Luke, and John, and never adequately accounted for by 2,000 years of commentary. In 2005, patent lawyer and amateur biblical scholar Stephen Carlson published The Gospel Hoax, arguing on handwriting and stylistic grounds that Smith forged the letter himself, pointing to what he read as deliberate, shaky pen strokes meant to imitate an 18th century scribal hand, and to thematic echoes between the letter's content and Smith's own later academic preoccupations with secrecy and sexuality in early Christianity. Biblical scholars including Bruce Metzger and Quentin Quesnel had already voiced suspicion decades earlier. Quesnel traveled to compare the handwriting directly against other manuscripts at Mar Saba, written in a similar 18th century hand. Hoping to prove forgery conclusively, he couldn't. Enough authentic samples shared the same quirks that Quesnel was forced to admit the comparison alone couldn't settle anything, and the case remained, in his own words, unresolved. What makes this particularly disturbing is not whether the letter is genuine. It's that the manuscript itself. The only physical object that could settle the question through modern ink and parchment analysis was eventually moved from Mar Saba to the Jerusalem Patriarchate's library, and from that point forward, effectively vanished from independent examination. Scholars who traveled to examine it found only photographs on file, or were told the relevant volume could not be located. As of the most recent scholarly accounts, its current location remains unconfirmed, and no scientific dating of the ink or parchment has ever been performed on the physical object, only on Morton Smith's photographs of it. The scholarly deadlock has, if anything, deepened rather than resolved with time. A 2021 study by Jeffrey Smith of the University of Texas and Brent Lando of the same institution argued that neither the wholesale forgery theory nor the straightforward ancient authenticity theory adequately explains the letter, situating it instead within Mar Saba's own documented history of monastic scribal practice and textual invention. Treating the manuscript's origin as a genuinely open historical question rather than a solved case in either direction. That a manuscript can generate a full academic monograph 70 years after its discovery, arguing that the field still doesn't know what it's looking at, says something about how thoroughly its disappearance has frozen the investigation in place. Every later scholar has been forced to work from Morton Smith's own photographs, taken by Morton Smith, developed by Morton Smith, and never independently verified against the physical page by an outside laboratory using the ink dating or paper analysis techniques that have resolved comparable manuscript disputes elsewhere. Smith himself never wavered publicly in 30 years of defending the discovery's authenticity, dying in 1991, still insisting the letter was genuine, still maintaining he had done nothing more than photograph what he found on a monastery shelf. His critics have noted, not unfairly, that a man capable of executing a forgery sophisticated enough to survive 50 years of scrutiny would also be exactly the kind of man who could maintain that composure to his deathbed. The observation cuts both ways, and neither side has ever produced the one thing that would settle it: the actual page, in a laboratory, under modern instruments. What is left is a set of photographs taken by the one man whose entire scholarly reputation depended on those photographs being believed. The manuscript that could prove or disprove him is gone. The unexplained naked young man in canonical Mark is still there, unresolved, in a gospel nearly 2 billion people read without ever being told no one has ever explained why he's in it. Number 1. The box beneath the altar. In 1940, under absolute secrecy and at Pope Pius X's direct order, 2 Jesuit priests, Father Antonio Ferrua and Father Engelbert Kirschbaum, began excavating beneath the high altar of St. Peter's Basilica at night, so as not to disrupt the daily business of the busiest church on earth. What they were looking for had been the subject of Christian tradition for 19 centuries. The grave of the Apostle Peter, martyred, according to that tradition, in Nero's circus just outside the Vatican Hill sometime around 64 or 67 AD. Working at night, under a basilica that receives thousands of pilgrims by day, the 2 priests uncovered a 2nd century monument that the early church historian Eusebius had described secondhand, quoting a Roman Christian named Gaius, writing around 200 AD, who claimed, "I can show you the trophies of the apostles." The excavators found the monument itself, 2 niches carved into a low wall, one above the other, precisely where Christian tradition for 19 centuries had insisted Peter's grave should be. In 1949, digging beneath the main altar with permission finally secured after years of delay, the team uncovered what came to be called the poor man's grave, a plain, unmarked burial with no inscription, dated to the right period, in the right location, containing no bones at all. The man overseeing the physical plant of the basilica, Monsignor Ludwig Koss, was not part of the excavation team and did not approve of how it was being conducted. Believing the bones his workers were uncovering elsewhere in the necropolis were being handled without proper respect, Koss quietly had them removed from a niche in a wall the excavators called the graffiti wall and placed in a wooden box in storage, without telling Ferrua's team what he had done. It would be over a decade before anyone connected to the excavation learned the bones had ever existed. Ferrua's official 1951 report, published after 12 years of secret work, covered the western end of the necropolis, but stopped short of confirming Peter's remains had been found at all. In December 1950, Pope Pius CE himself said publicly that human bones had been found near the tomb, but that it was impossible to prove with certainty that they belonged to the apostle, a careful, almost deflating public statement for a discovery that had taken a decade of secret nighttime labor to produce. The case reopened by accident. In 1953, epigraphist Margherita Guarducci, a world-renowned expert on ancient inscriptions and professor at the University of Rome, and one of the first outsiders permitted to tour the necropolis after Koss's death that same year, noticed graffiti on the wall that Ferrua's team had dismissed as a legible scrawl. She spent years deciphering it, eventually concluding that fragments read as messages from Christian pilgrims writing in code during periods of persecution, culminating in a phrase she restored as Petros ne, Peter is here. Ferrua read the same fragmentary letters differently, Petros ende, Peter is not here, and the 2 scholars, both devout Catholics working under the same pope, spent the following decades locked in open, bitter, personal dispute over 4 characters of Greek. In the course of her research, a workman mentioned to Guarducci that he knew where a box of bones from the site had gone. She tracked it down, still sitting forgotten in a Vatican storeroom over a decade after Koss had hidden it. She asked Pope Pius C directly for permission to have the contents analyzed, and in 1962, the bones were examined by Professor Venerando Correnti of the University of Palermo. The results were specific enough to sound engineered for the purpose. A single robust man, 60 to 70 years old, wrapped at burial in cloth-dyed royal purple and threaded with gold thread. A burial treatment suggesting real status, not an anonymous pauper's grave. The feet were missing entirely, severed rather than decayed away naturally, consistent, forensically, with the well-documented ancient Roman practice of removing a crucified body from its cross by cutting through the ankles, since prying out the iron nails was slower and less practical. On June 26, 1968, Pope Paul VI announced to the world that the relics of St. Peter had been identified in a way we believe convincing. Ferrua never accepted it. After Paul VI died in 1978, and with his chief papal supporter gone, Ferrua moved against Guarducci directly, removing her from any further access to the necropolis or the graffiti wall, and according to multiple later accounts. Having the bones identified as Peter's quietly withdrawn from public view for a period afterward, Ebla required a government to force a scholar's public recantation. Marsaba required a manuscript to disappear entirely from independent view. Beneath the altar of the largest church in Christendom, what the record shows is quieter, and, in its way, more damning, a Monsignor who hid a discovery from the men who made it, an official 1950 papal statement that publicly declined to claim what had truly been found, and a forgotten wooden box that sat ignored in a Vatican storeroom for over a decade before anyone thought to ask what was inside. 3 sealed institutions. 3 different methods of controlling what the public was allowed to know. Not one required an external enemy. Each was accomplished entirely from within the institution that had the most to lose. None of this proves the bones are Peter's. Ferrua's objection was not frivolous. The graffiti is fragmentary. The reading genuinely ambiguous, and reputable scholars continue to hold that the identification was never conclusively demonstrated. The purple and gold cloth, the severed feet, the correct age and build, all of it is circumstantial, consistent with the tradition rather than proof of it. What is not circumstantial is the pattern of handling. A pope who authorized a secret excavation, an official who hid what it found, 2 Vatican-appointed scholars who spent decades unable to agree on 4 Greek letters, a woman who reopened the case, won the argument publicly, and was frozen out of the site the moment her chief supporter in Rome was gone. The bones now rest in a series of small reliquary boxes, tucked back into the graffiti wall niche, several stories beneath the altar where the Pope celebrates Mass above them. Visits require booking months in advance. Children under 12 are not permitted. Photography is forbidden throughout. Even the pallia, the ornamental sashes the Pope bestows on new archbishops each year, are stored in a casket set into the same niche, a modern ceremony layered directly on top of a 19th century old dispute neither Ferrua nor Guarducci lived to see fully resolved. And in 2013, when asked directly whether the remains are authentically Peter's, the Vatican's own position, as reported at the time, was that it no longer requires anyone to believe they are. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.